Welcome Me to the Kingdom is a collection of connected narratives set mainly in Bangkok and spanning the period from the 1970s to the present. Characters fade in and out of the narrative, disappearing in the hope of better lives elsewhere, then reappearing later, older and possibly, but not always, wiser. These lives overlap in unpredictable ways, and it feels as if the city is the only constant holding together these fascinating, unseen histories, although Bangkok itself is also shown to be in a constant state of flux. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode, I invite an author or expert to give their views on the work of literature, and today I'm joined by Mai Nardone, author of Welcome Me to the Kingdom. You're about to watch us in conversation at Mahidol University International College as part of the annual Arts and Culture Festival there, the theme for which this year is Flux. I hope our conversation inspires you to read Welcome Me to the Kingdom, and if you have any comments, please do leave them below the video. If you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Mai Nardone is a Thai-American author who lives in Bangkok. He's been awarded fellowships from Breadloaf, Kundiman and MacDowell. Welcome Me to the Kingdom is his first book, and it was a New York Times editor's choice, as well as being longlisted for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. It's a pleasure to welcome Mai to the World Literature Podcast. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We will make a start. So a very warm welcome to this interview with Mai Nardone about his book, Welcome Me to the Kingdom, as part of the Arts and Culture Festival here at Mahidol University International College. This is also being recorded for the World Literature Podcast and will be published online very shortly. So Mai, a warm welcome to all three of those things. Thank you so much for joining us here. Great to be talking to you. And could you begin just by telling us a little bit about Welcome Me to the Kingdom, maybe an overview, why you think people might be interested in reading it?
Yeah. Thank you, John Ivan, for inviting me to this, and the Mahidol International College for having me here. So the book is a linked short story collection set in Thailand that loosely follows three kind of family groupings it begins around 1980 and goes up through the 97 financial crisis into the 2010s. And the reason that when John Ivan asked me if I could single out one of the stories for everyone to read for today's discussion, I was drawn to the story Easy because it takes place during the 97 financial crisis, which became kind of the epicenter for this book, and the rest of the story the rest of the story collection kind of revolves around that moment. And just to give a bit of context for that, the story collection opens with a prologue in 1980 with a couple of the characters who are in one of these loose family groupings who kind of come down to Bangkok, and they're looking for opportunity. And this is at the same moment that the country is going through this transition from sort of a agrarian economy to a more industrialized, centralized country. And the opening, the prologue, sort of acts as a promise for the potential of the people who are coming down here and what was promised then. And the 97 crisis is sort of like a breaking point in that promise. And then it sort of goes on from there into the aftermath and then into nearly contemporary, 2010s. And then the last thing about it is the one thing, and this is really something that my savvy publisher came up with as a way to sort of like loosely bring these characters together, which is about everyone in the story collection is sort of a striver, whether they are trying to move up through illicit means or through their own smarts. They're all trying to kind of like climb up the social economic ladder, and they succeed or do not to various degrees.
Thank you. Thanks for that useful overview. And I wanted to start with, the nature of the collection. It's subtitled Stories, not actually on the cover, but inside. And several of the pieces were published previously. So, I was thinking when I was reading it, I experienced it as a novel, I think. Maybe that's partly due to my own biases. I read novels primarily. You did publish a number of them before. So did you conceive of it as a large piece when you were first writing those? Do you think of it as a collection or as a novel? Does that distinction matter at all?
Yeah, so it's interesting actually on the US edition, they've written stories in like very small font in the corner here. On my UK publisher decided to leave it off entirely, and one of the sort of unglamorous realities of this is that like short story collections just really don't sell, and so it's a hard sell in general to get people to pick up a story collection, which is why my savvy UK publisher put it on the inside cover instead of on the outside. For me, so I started writing this around I think the first story dates from like 2012, and I was in grad school at the time, and there's something called the Masters of Fine Arts in the US, these writing programs that date from the 1970s, and they're sort of a little bit seen as kind of these factories that churn out writers, and the form of the MFA program is the short story, which is why it also has the feeling of this like uniquely American form, because there are so many short story writers coming out of the States who come out of these schools. And so at the time, I was writing short stories already, and I felt like I was kind of a short story purist. And actually, so this relates to something, I'm reading this book called, nonfiction called How Music Works, and it's sort of changed the way that I've thought about the stories in this book and the novel that I'm currently working on as well, where the author of How Music Works makes this argument that a lot of music, and even the instrumentation and the types of music that came out of different environments, are shaped by the context. And so he argues that, for example, like more percussive music was more popular in open spaces, in sort of African tribal environments, because the music sounded better there compared to choral music in European cathedrals, compared to jazz, which was originally sort of brought about as like a dance music. And he says in this I didn't realize is the reason we have jazz improvisations was the musicians would run out of sheet music and they would improvise to keep the song going so that people could continue to dance. And then so in that way, like the stories, the context that I was writing in really shaped stories. I was reading short story collections, and short stories are just like a really excellent, for any of the writers out there, if there are any, they're an excellent way to experiment, because they're 5,000 words. If they don't work out, you can put them away, you can put them in a dust drawer, you can start something over. And when I had this conversation with my editor, what she said, because I was trying to be more commercial about it, and I told her up front that, look, I know nobody really wants to read a short story collection. It's linked stories. The characters kind of recur. Do you think it could be a novel? And she said no, and her point about it was that some of the characters appear in different forms, and so a character who might have a first-person voice earlier on appears in the second person, or with a monologue later on, or just sort of like, and those switches are sort of harder and more jarring to people who are expecting a novel. And then the final thing that I've only recently realized about this as I'm trying to write a novel is that like actually stories, people often think of novels as kind of like the form where you have a lot more freedom, because you can be more discursive, because you can kind of, there's just a lot of excess to novels. But actually with novels, all the decisions that you make early in the novel end up really narrowing where you can go in your writing in the end. So if you've chosen these three characters all in the third person, then by the end of the novel, you're still writing three characters in the third person. And your world kind of like closes in on you a little bit. Whereas with a short story collection, you can have all this variety, because each story kind of starts again and is able to make its own forms. And actually just really appreciate that. And so I do think of it as a story collection, even though there are kind of these links that hopefully make it a more, so that the sum is sort of more than its parts.
Interesting to hear you talk about the writing process with regard to short stories, because I think a lot of people start writing fiction, short stories. A lot of the audience here are creative writing students here, and we're doing short stories because you kind of have to. You can't just launch in and write a novel. You could try. That would be a difficult thing to do. In terms of, you talked a lot about the writing process just now, but, you used an interesting phrase. You called yourself a short story purist. I mean, would you make a case for the short story as an art form, not just in terms of the writing process, but as, I think it's often thought of as kind of not at the same level as the novel. Would you make a case for it being as serious a kind of art form as the novel? And if so, why?
I think that the brevity of short stories just, it's like it's not really a sprint marathon comparison, but it's more like what you can do experimentally with a short story is often a lot more interesting just because you can leave so much out of it. I think of again, mostly Americans. Are there any, I can't think of any UK writers right now who only write short stories, but there are kind of these great American older generation writers who pretty much have only ever written short stories, like Deborah Eisenberg, and they are kind of purists to this form. And when you read a Deborah Eisenberg short story, you realize that that is her form, and she could, what she's doing and how complicated it is, it couldn't possibly sustain itself over the length of a novel. And so it is something more original, which is why some of the more prominent magazines out there that publish short stories still, and there are fewer every year, they sometimes will publish excerpts from novels. Usually it's like a Salman Rushdie or someone of that caliber. Therefore, they will kind of break their rule with a short story. And you can often see that the form of it is really like a novel excerpt, and it's not a short story, even if they've given it some sort of narrative arc in order to make it look like that.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting to hear those thoughts on the short story. I mentioned my own bias towards novels, so try to rethink that a little bit. Moving on to some of the specifics, I think one of my favorite stories is one called City of Brass, and it's about a couple who are described as having got together when they're relatively young and, quote, at an age when dating was still about potential, end quote. But the story shows them having passed beyond that phase, and beyond the phase of potential and having to deal with the kind of hard realities of life. And it felt as if that kind of paralleled the situation of a lot of the characters in the whole collection. Both there are foreigners, non-Thais who come into Thailand, seeing it as a place of potential. Obviously it's somewhere that markets itself very well. It's incredibly popular, but also Thais coming in from elsewhere in the country, specifically the countryside. So the city seems to be a place of potential, but in many cases that potential seems to not be met and reality bites. Is Bangkok all illusion?
I'm really glad you singled out this story. It's my favorite story. Nobody ever talks about it, so I never get to talk about this story. I think because it's a little more contemporary than the rest of the collection. It deals with a young professional couple. So the idea of Bangkok is illusion. So the story is called City of Brass, and I really, just to give a little context for the story, I am a big fan of imitation. For anyone who is starting to write out, pick your favorite, story writer, novelist, whoever, and just try to adapt their style for a little bit. It never works, which is kind of the great thing about it. But it's a really good way to experiment. And with this story, I had been thinking for years about, there's a famous short story by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, called The South. And it's a story about kind of machismo culture and the myth of the gaucho, which is kind of like the Argentinian cowboy, and this academic who thinks about his forefathers and he wants to be part of this machismo culture. And he's reading the 1001 Nights, Arabian Nights, which is itself a text about reinventing yourself or keeping yourself alive through story. And so like the text itself sort of extends the life of Scheherazade, who is telling the story, and sort of indefinitely almost. And there's this great ambiguity in the Borges story of where, so the character, this is sort of a spoiler, but not really, the character ends up kind of in a gaucho knife fight in this mythical kind of south of Argentina that doesn't really exist anymore. And there's this boundary between where we believe like the character's imagination has taken over the story versus where we think the character's life or story might have ended otherwise. And Borges is just like an amazing postmodernist that was doing a lot of the stuff that is coming back into popularity now, and he was doing it, you know, a generation ago. And so I was looking at this story thinking like, okay, how can I write something similar, which is where this story comes about. And it is in some parts about like disillusionment with the city, and in this particular story it's about the stories we tell ourselves in order to, in this case, keep a relationship going, and the narrator's reliability comes into question. And there's also a 1001 Nights element of like telling a story in order to keep something alive, in order to perpetuate a myth. And I just love those kinds of layers, and I think that it can be a lot of fun to play with those. And it's the sort of thing where if it didn't work, it would have been fine, but even the process of experimenting and imitation is just like really worthwhile, and that's how that story came about.
Interesting in your answer, you went to Borges, you know, sort of one of the great postmodernist writers, and, you know, sense in postmodernism that the world becomes text and we're, you know, trapped in this prison house of language, which when postmodernism is criticized, it's criticized for this sort of detachment from reality. But I wanted to come back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the centrality of the financial crisis to this collection, and the fact that that material reality, you know, see again and again in the collection, characters struggling either with poverty in quite extreme cases, or simply with the fact that they can't fulfill their desires, you know, in terms of moving up the social ladder. So how do you sort of put those two things together, this kind of playful textuality and the reality of, you know, financial struggles and, you know, material needs in many of the stories?
Yeah, I mean, the financial struggle, and even the reason that, so I was 8 years old in 97, but for my mother's generation, my mom who's Thai Chinese, this was sort of like the defining and ultimately like cataclysmic event for the Thai middle class at the time, in which, you know, for example, her brother has been in bankruptcy ever since. For a lot of them, it was kind of the end of potential, and it was also the end of this phase. Like, so from 1980s going forwards, Thailand's industrializing. We're seeing this sort of end of history moment where we're being promised this Western-style democracy, globalized economy will sort of bring everyone into the middle class, and that's kind of what was happening for them until 97, and that promise was kind of broken. And for a lot of these families, and it happens in this collection, but it's also interesting that you drive down Pitbury or something, and you still see a lot of these empty concrete buildings that are legacies of that era, of these companies that went bankrupt. Something like 1/3 of big companies in Thailand went bankrupt during that period. And so it's sort of like these characters, there's the individual lives, and then there's sort of the economic kind of box that they're in, that they're not really able to transcend. And regularly Thailand tops, you know, these lists of most unequal countries in the world on this kind of Gini coefficient index. And so it's sort of trying to reckon with that fact. I was told the other day, just to give context to what percentage of Thailand, because especially like I live in fairly downtown Bangkok, and it often looks like I'm surrounded by office workers and this is just what Thailand is. I was told the other day that the percentage of Thais who meet the threshold to pay income tax of all Thais, I think, is 7% is, and I think the threshold is something like 25,000 baht. So that's like how few people belong to this sort of office culture class, and everyone else actually falls below that. And so like, I wanted, and it's a country with a lot of indebtedness, and I sort of wanted all these things to come about. So even in moments when, like, there's a story about chon kai, like cockfighting, chicken fighting, the sport, and that's one, I didn't even know that was legal until I started writing the story. This story was written later, and it was during COVID when I was spending a lot of time on Thai YouTube, and I came across this guy who would teach you how to raise your chickens for fighting, and he himself raised a lot of money on these fights, and he has a chicken. So the chickens are valued based on how much they win in a match. He has a chicken that is worth something like 71 million baht, based on how much this chicken won during this fight. And I realized, went to visit him to sort of research this, I guess. And I realized that his business model was selling chickens to all these other aspiring people who wanted to make their millions like he did. And the reality is, when you talk to a lot of these people who are buying a chicken for 10,000 baht or whatever, 30,000 baht, is that those pathways are just not open to them. It's the same way that the lottery sort of dominates attention when it comes out twice a month. Like, if you're around ordinary Thais on a lottery day, that's kind of the only topic of conversation. And it just feels like there are ways in which the promises of that era were never realized, and I wanted that to be reflected in the book, which is why these characters do often seem sort of trapped by their economic circumstances.
Thank you. Can we move on